Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Speak Smart podcast. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into some awesome tips for learning English. Even if you're super busy, we'll be pulling these tips from a really popular podcast episode that's just packed with advice.
Yeah, you know what's really cool about this episode is how it kind of turns the whole idea of language learning on its head. Like, instead of telling you that you need to carve out hours and hours to study, it shows you how to fit English practice into your daily routine, no matter how crazy busy you are.
I love that. It's almost like turning these everyday moments into these little learning opportunities. And you don't have to completely change your whole life to do it. Like, for example, did you know that just noticing English words on signs or labels can actually be a really good way to build your vocabulary?
Exactly. It's all about just being aware of the language around you. And, this idea of microlearning, which is what they call it in the episode, is something that kind of comes up over and over again in their advice. It's like snack size learning, perfect for people who are, pressed for time. Even just 5 minutes here and there can really make a difference.
That is so encouraging to hear, because I think it's easy to get overwhelmed thinking you need to have these huge blocks of time to study. But this episode really emphasizes that consistency is so much more important than these long marathon study sessions.
Totally. Consistency is key. So instead of trying to do these super long study sessions every once in a while, the podcast recommends actually setting up a regular schedule, even if it's just for 10 minutes a day.
It's like that saying, a little bit often goes a long way.
Yes, exactly. Scheduling even these short little bursts of practice makes language learning a lot more intentional. It's like saying, okay, this is important to me and I'm making time for it in my life.
I love that mindset shift. And the episode also talks about getting creative with time management, not just in terms of scheduling dedicated study time, but they also talk about this concept of multitasking, which is incorporating listening practice into things you're already doing, like chores or your commute or even working out.
That's such a good strategy, because it's all about using those little pockets of time that you might normally just, waste.
Yeah.
So instead of just mindlessly listening to music during your commute, why not listen to an English podcast?
Right. It's like sneaking in some extra learning without even having to set aside any extra time.
Fair.
Now, I will say, obviously, not every task is going to be good for multitasking with language practice. If you need to really focus on your work, you probably shouldn't be listening to a podcast at the same time.
Right. It's all about being mindful and choosing activities that complement your English practice. So let's move on to vocabulary building, which is something that the podcast spends a lot of time talking about. They really emphasize how important it is to actively engage with new words, not just kind of glance at them and move on.
Yeah. It's almost like they're encouraging you to become a word detective, always on the lookout for new discoveries.
Exactly. They suggest keeping a notebook or a note-taking app handy so you can jot down any unfamiliar words that you come across. This super simple habit can turn everyday experiences into vocabulary building opportunities. Imagine you're reading an article and you come across a word you don't recognize. Instead of just skipping over it, you pause, write it down, and then you can look it up later.
It's like turning the whole world into your own personal English dictionary.
Exactly. And they go beyond just writing down the word. They talk about the importance of repetition, both written and spoken. So try saying the new word out loud a few times, using it in a sentence. You can even record yourself to check your pronunciation.
Repeating new words out loud is such a good way to make them stick in your memory. It's like a mini workout for your pronunciation muscles.
Totally. And don't forget to have fun with it. The episode reminds us that it's okay to learn through games, videos, apps, even music. If you're enjoying yourself, you're way more likely to keep going.
Right. It's like sneaking veggies into a smoothie. You're getting all the good stuff.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like a chore.
I love that analogy. Okay, so let's move beyond just individual words for a second and talk about how the podcast recommends creating an immersive English environment, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country.
I love that. It's so cool how they encourage you to transform your surroundings into this language learning playground.
Exactly. They suggest starting by just becoming more aware of the English words that are already around you, pay attention to signs, menus, product labels, all those little bits of English that we often just tune out.
Right. It's like a treasure hunt for language.
Right.
You start noticing English everywhere you go.
Exactly. And then they take it a step further and encourage you to actively transform your personal spaces into English zones.
Oh, yeah. One of their suggestions is changing the language settings on your phone and computer to English.
Such a small change. But think about how much of an impact that can have over time. Every time you check your phone, you're reinforcing your familiarity with English menus and terminology.
It's like you're constantly immersing yourself in the language.
Yeah.
Without even really thinking about it.
Exactly.
And for people who are more visual learners, they have this really fun and tactile approach. They suggest using sticky notes.
Oh, yeah, the sticky note strategy. That's a good one.
So you write the English word for everyday objects.
Yeah.
And you stick it on the object itself.
Right.
So like label your refrigerator, your mirror, your coffee mug.
Yeah.
And suddenly your whole house is like this personalized English vocabulary builder.
Exactly. It's a great way to create constant visual reinforcement. Cool. And you can do it gradually too. Like start with a few key objects and then just, expand your sticky note vocabulary as you learn new words. So speaking of immersion, let's talk about how the podcast suggests using earbuds for language learning.
Oh yeah. Earbuds. Those tiny but mighty tools. The podcast really emphasizes how they can be a total game changer for passive learning.
They really can. Like, think about it. You're cooking dinner, folding laundry, going for a walk. These are all activities where your mind might be free to wander, even if your hands are busy. So why not use that time to listen to an English podcast, audiobook, or even music?
Such a smart way to make those everyday activities into learning opportunities. It's like having a personal English tutor whispering in your ear while you go about your day.
Exactly.
And they specifically mention music as well.
Oh yeah, music is so powerful. You can listen to English songs, look up the lyrics, sing along, even try to figure out what the words mean. It's a fun and engaging way to practice pronunciation, expand your vocabulary, and just immerse yourself in the rhythm and flow of the language.
Yeah. It's like turning your commute into a personal concert and language lesson all rolled into one.
Exactly.
Now, for people who are more visual learners, the podcast talks about the power of subtitles.
Subtitles can be amazing, especially for visual learners. Watching English movies or TV shows with subtitles allows you to see and hear the language at the same time. So it reinforces both your listening comprehension and your reading skills. Plus, it exposes you to natural language patterns in a really engaging context.
It's like having a built-in language decoder right there on your screen.
Exactly.
And if you come across a word you don't know, you can always just pause and look it up.
Exactly. It turns entertainment into an active learning experience.
Right.
So before we move on, curious, what stood out to you the most so far from all these different strategies?
What really strikes me is just how adaptable and accessible all these tips are. It's not about finding these like massive chunks of time or totally overhauling your life. It's about finding these little moments, these little opportunities that already exist in your day and using them to your advantage.
Totally agree. And that actually brings us to another key point that the podcast makes, which is the power of microlearning, which we touched on a little bit earlier.
Yes, microlearning. Those little bite-sized learning bursts that are perfect for our busy lives.
Exactly. It's about using those 5 or 10-minute intervals that we often just dismiss as being too short for meaningful learning.
Right. It's like saying, okay, I might not have a full hour to spare, but I can definitely do 5 minutes. And those 5 minutes, repeated day after day, can lead to some really significant progress.
Absolutely. And the beauty of microlearning is that it's so flexible. You can squeeze in a quick vocabulary review on your phone while you're waiting in line, listen to a short English podcast during your lunch break, or even practice a few phrases with a language learning app before bed.
Right. It's all about making the most of those little pockets of time that might otherwise just be wasted. And it's encouraging to know that even those short bursts of learning can actually contribute to your overall progress.
Totally. It's a mindset shift. We need to start recognizing the value of those seemingly insignificant moments. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how the podcast suggests turning these micro moments and all these other learning strategies into sustainable habits. Yeah, so the podcast really stresses that habits are kind of like the secret sauce of language learning. They basically automate all those actions, making practice feel a lot less like a chore and more like something you just naturally do. So how do we cultivate those magical habits?
Well, the podcast has some pretty clever ideas. One is to, try to integrate English practice into your existing routine. So instead of mindlessly scrolling on your phone first thing in the morning, maybe you could listen to an English news podcast or swap out that, pre-bedtime social media check for a few minutes of reviewing flashcards or something.
Right. It's all about weaving these little threads of English into your day. The episode also emphasizes that it's really important to show up consistently, even when you're not feeling super motivated. It's about making practice non-negotiable, kind of like brushing your teeth.
Yeah. They argue that doing even a little bit each day is way more effective than those like sporadic marathon study sessions. It's all about that steady drip, drip, drip of practice that eventually fills up your language learning bucket.
Exactly. And if those drips start to feel a little bit, monotonous, the podcast encourages us to switch things up a bit. So like if you're always studying from textbooks, maybe try watching a funny English movie or playing a language learning game or something.
Yeah. Variety is the spice of language learning.
Totally.
And not only does it keep things interesting, but it also exposes you to different aspects of the language, different learning styles, and different contexts.
Absolutely. And speaking of making learning engaging, the podcast's a big fan of using visual aids whenever possible. So think pictures, diagrams, flashcards, anything that can help those words and concepts really stick in your mind.
Oh yeah, flashcards are a classic for a reason.
Totally.
They're portable, perfect for microlearning, and you can basically tailor them to any topic or skill you're working on. The podcast even suggests getting creative and like drawing little pictures on your flashcards.
Yeah.
Help you remember them better.
Yeah. It's a fun way to personalize your learning and kind of tap into that visual learning style. And if you're into tech, there are tons of flashcard apps out there that use spaced repetition, which is a technique that basically optimizes learning by scheduling reviews at specific intervals.
Oh yeah, spaced repetition.
That's a good one.
The podcast explains that it's based on this idea that we remember information better when we review it right before we're about to forget it. It's like giving your memory a little nudge at just the right time.
Exactly. Spaced repetition helps to move information from short-term memory to long-term memory. And a lot of those flashcard apps do this automatically, so you don't even have to think about it.
So we've got our schedule, our microlearning moments, our flashcards. But how do we actually make sure all this learning is like really sinking in?
Well, the podcast stresses the importance of regular review. It's not enough to just learn something once and then forget about it. You have to go back and revisit the material, test yourself, and make sure you're really retaining all those hard-earned skills and vocabulary.
And they actually have a pretty unique take on review. They suggest trying to teach what you've learned to someone else.
Oh, yeah. Teaching is such a powerful learning tool.
It is.
When you have to explain a concept to someone else, it forces you to think about it more deeply, organize your thoughts, and it just solidifies your understanding.
Yeah, it's like you're taking on the role of the expert, which can be a great confidence booster too.
Totally.
And for people who enjoy writing, the podcast recommends keeping a learning journal.
Oh yeah, a journal is a great way to track your progress, reflect on your learning journey, and celebrate your achievements. You can jot down new words, grammar rules, thoughts on different learning strategies, even just your overall feelings about the process.
Right. It's like creating this personalized roadmap of your English learning adventure.
Exactly.
And they even suggest trying to write in English in your journal,
Yeah.
even if it's just a few sentences each day, as a way to practice expressing yourself and kind of solidify those grammar skills.
Yeah, writing is such a valuable tool for language learners, but it often gets overlooked. Just like with speaking, the more you write, the more fluent and confident you become.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about weaving English into our routines, showing up consistently, embracing variety, using visuals, reviewing strategically, teaching others, even journaling about our learning journey. It's amazing how many different strategies this podcast offers for making language learning both effective and enjoyable.
I know, it's really impressive. And what I think is really cool is how much emphasis they put on the learner's agency. Like, they're not trying to dictate a rigid path or anything. It's all about encouraging you to experiment, find what works best for you, and create a personalized learning plan that fits your own individual needs and goals.
Yeah, it's about taking ownership of your learning journey and making it your own. But I think it's natural with so many different strategies and techniques out there to kind of wonder, how do I actually know if all this effort is paying off?
That's a great question, and the podcast actually addresses that directly. They have a whole section on measuring progress and making sure you're on the right track.
Perfect. Well, let's dive into that in the next part of our deep dive. All right, so we've talked about a ton of different ways to like squeeze English practice into our busy lives. Everything from, micro-learning to sticky notes to turning our commutes into these like little language immersion sessions. But how do we actually know if all of this is like working? How do we know if we're making progress? I think it's easy to feel like you're just like treading water sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
especially with a language as complex as English.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And the podcast actually spends a good chunk of time talking about the importance of tracking your progress, not just for motivation, but also to kind of like guide your learning. It's easy to get lost in this sea of vocabulary and grammar rules, but if you have a system for measuring your progress, it's like having a compass. It helps you stay on course.
I love that analogy. So what are some of the specific techniques they suggest for like charting our language learning voyage?
Well, one really simple but powerful tool they recommend is the learning journal. And it's more than just a diary. It's like a record of your entire learning journey, a place where you can document your discoveries, track your goals, celebrate your wins.
Right. It's like this tangible record of all your growth, something you can look back on and actually see how far you've come. I imagine that can be super motivating, especially when those, inevitable moments of doubt start to creep in.
Oh, absolutely. It's a reminder that you are making progress, even if it feels really small sometimes. The podcast also talks about the importance of self-testing, not in a formal, high-pressure way, but more as a way to just like check in with yourself and see what's sticking.
Right. So not necessarily like quizzes and exams and stuff, but more like trying to remember vocabulary words from memory. Or having a conversation in English without using a dictionary.
Yeah.
Or maybe watching a short video without subtitles to see how much you understand.
Exactly. It's about actively engaging with the language and seeing where your strengths and weaknesses are. They even suggest keeping track of how much time you spend studying, whether it's using an app that automatically logs your sessions, or just like marking the days you practice on a calendar.
Yeah, the power of streaks. There's something so satisfying about seeing that visual representation of your commitment. It's like a game almost. It motivates you to keep that streak going.
Totally. It taps into that natural desire for accomplishment and progress. And sometimes the most rewarding measure of progress is just noticing how much easier certain tasks are becoming.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like realizing you can understand more of a song's lyrics than you used to. Or reading an English article without having to constantly look up words. Those aha moments are so validating.
They really are. And the podcast reminds us to pay attention to those small victories, to celebrate our progress along the way, instead of just focusing on the end goal. Oh, and of course, they recommend recording yourself speaking English, which can help you track improvements in your pronunciation and fluency over time.
Yeah. I know it can be kind of cringy to listen to yourself at first, but it's such a valuable tool for identifying areas where you can improve, especially those like subtle pronunciation nuances that you might not even realize you're doing.
Totally. It's like having your own personal language coach who can give you feedback on your speaking style. So speaking of speaking, the podcast spends a lot of time addressing the fear and anxiety that often comes with speaking a new language.
Oh yeah. That's definitely one of the biggest hurdles for a lot of language learners. It can be so intimidating to actually speak.
It really can.
So what kind of advice do they offer for overcoming those speaking challenges?
Well, their approach is really encouraging and practical. They emphasize starting small, like maybe just practicing a few sentences a day, and not letting the fear of making mistakes hold you back.
Yeah. It's like they're saying, it's okay to stumble, it's okay to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
Exactly. They want us to see mistakes as opportunities for growth. And they suggest finding a safe space to practice speaking, like with a supportive friend, a language tutor, or even just talking to yourself in the mirror.
Yeah. Having someone to practice with can make a huge difference. It makes the whole experience a lot more interactive and engaging.
Definitely.
But even if you don't have a language partner readily available, the podcast suggests talking to yourself in English, like narrating your actions, practicing pronunciation, even having little imaginary conversations in your head.
Right. It might feel silly at first, but it's a great way to get comfortable with the sounds and rhythms of the language without feeling self-conscious. It's like creating your own little English immersion bubble.
I love that.
And they have this great tip for when you get stuck and can't remember the right word. Paraphrasing.
Oh yeah. Paraphrasing is such a useful skill.
It really is.
It's all about finding creative ways to express yourself, even when you have a limited vocabulary. It's about being resourceful with language and finding ways to get your message across, even if you don't know the exact word you need.
Exactly. And they also talk about the importance of asking questions during conversations, not just to clarify things you don't understand, but also as a way to actively engage with the other person and keep the conversation going.
Right. Asking questions shows that you're curious and interested.
It does.
And it also helps you practice formulating questions in English, which is a really important communication skill.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about passively listening, it's about actively participating in the conversation.
Exactly.
And for people who are looking for a more structured way to practice speaking, the podcast recommends this technique called shadowing.
Oh yeah, shadowing is a fantastic way to train your ear and your mouth to produce the sounds of English more naturally. Basically, you listen to a native speaker, and then you repeat what they say, trying to match their pronunciation and intonation as closely as possible.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to become their vocal shadow, mimicking all those little inflections and nuances.
And they also recommend the classic technique of reading aloud, which allows you to work on your pronunciation, fluency, and comprehension all at the same time.
Yeah, reading aloud is great because it engages multiple senses, which makes the learning process a lot more immersive and enjoyable.
It does.
Wow. We've gotten so much great advice for improving speaking skills. But the podcast doesn't stop there. They also have some tips for improving a writing skill.
Oh yeah, for sure. They emphasize that writing is a great way to organize your thoughts in English, practice grammar rules, and expand your vocabulary. They suggest things like writing emails, messages, even journal entries, just to get comfortable expressing yourself in written form.
Those are all great ways to practice writing in a more informal, low-pressure setting.
Exactly.
And they also recommend using grammar checking tools to catch those little errors that we might miss on our own.
Yeah, grammar checkers can be super helpful. They can help you identify patterns in your mistakes and learn from them. Plus, they can give you more confidence in your writing.
This has been an incredible deep dive. So many practical and inspiring tips for learning English, even when we're super busy.
I know, it's been amazing.
What really stands out to me is the emphasis on finding joy in the learning process, celebrating those small wins, and remembering that every little bit of effort counts.
Absolutely. It's a great reminder that language learning is a journey, not a destination. And the most important thing is to just keep moving forward, one step at a time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the Speak Smart podcast. We hope this deep dive has given you a ton of strategies for unlocking your English learning potential.
And remember, the most effective learning is the learning that you actually do. So pick a strategy that resonates with you and try it out today.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share this episode with anyone who's on their own English learning adventure. Until next time, happy learning.